This March, the Virginia War Memorial Foundation, in partnership with Richmond's Firehouse Theater, is proud to present War in Pieces for 2024. This annual theater festival features 4 professionally produced one-act plays written by veterans. The co-production has grown out of the Foundation's free veterans writing program, the Mighty Pen Project, a university-level creative writing class and workshop for veterans and their families, taught by me, David L. Robbins, author, professor, and founder of the Mighty Pen. Tickets are available now at firehousetheater.org. Come join us for remarkable stage performances from stories of heroism, sacrifice, and service in uniform.
It is so true that in the military, you are brothers. It's hard to explain to somebody that someone would give their life for you, but that's what Gary did.
An old soldier looks back over the life he led after it was saved in Vietnam by the sacrifice of a friend.
This was not my proudest moment, to leave a guy behind like that I could have saved. And I've often thought about it, but I had no choice. We were on a mission and we had to move out.
And he recalls feeling helpless when one of his own soldiers, another brave young man, could no longer face combat. Hello. Welcome to the Mighty Pen Podcast. I'm David L. Robbins, your host and founder of the Mighty Pen Project, a free writing program for veterans and their families, in partnership with the Virginia War Memorial Foundation in Richmond, Virginia. In this podcast, I'll sit down with Jess Lockhart, author of today's 2 stories, Valentine's Day and Bender. Jess spent almost 3 decades with the U.S. Army, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. Let's listen to Valentine's Day, movingly read by Alan Sater.
Valentine's Day, also known as St. Valentine's Day, is a celebration observed on or about February 14th each year. Hallmark has made this into a commercial success by making us afraid not to show up at home without a card, flowers, or candy. On February 14, 1969, I'm not sure I was even aware it was Valentine's Day, much less thinking of flowers and candy. However, I would have loved to have had a bottle of liquor. This story's not about me, but a friend who gave his life for me, First Lieutenant Gary Lee Miller, and another of my men, Patrick K. Dugan. I only knew Gary for about a month before he died. He was born and raised in a small town in the western part of Virginia, Covington, almost on the West Virginia state line. Covington was a typical small southern town where one industry, in this case West Vaco, was the primary source of income for the surrounding counties. Through the town flowed the Jackson River, with houses built on the steep banks overlooking the plant of 3,000 employees. Children grew up watching their fathers go to work in the plant, knowing that the only alternative to working in the plant was the coal mines of West Virginia. Gary broke this cycle by graduating with honors from high school and attending Virginia Tech. At Tech, he joined the ROTC program and graduated with an engineering degree and second lieutenant commission in the United States Army. After commissioning, Gary went to the Infantry Officers Basic Course, Fort Benning, Georgia. I don't know what his first duty assignment was, but he ended up in Vietnam assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, 3rd Brigade, 1st Battalion, 28th Infantry, named the Black Lions, in Company A. This is where I met Gary. I was Mike, platoon leader. The time was late January 1969. Although I had only been in Vietnam 3 months through attrition, I was the senior platoon leader, which in retrospect was really scary considering the lives I was responsible for at the old age of 21 years. Gary showed up just as we'd lost 2 platoon leaders, 1 killed, 1 wounded, and medevac to Japan. Gary was assigned as a replacement to Lima Platoon. I was assigned to mentor him until he was ready to operate on his own. So it's now February 14, 1969. Lima and Mike platoon were on a joint mission and had been on patrol for 3 or 4 days without any contact with the bad guys. Our ambush site that evening was a trail junction with the main trail going north-south and an intersecting trail going east-west. The trails weren't that well used. They looked like any cowpath you see in a pasture. I told Gary to set his platoon up, ambushing the main trail going north-south. We usually set up our ambushes in a straight line boxed off at either end. The main section of the ambush was covered with claymore mines, and the boxed ends were manned with M60 machine guns. I set my platoon, Mike, facing the east-west trail. I didn't exactly expect any activity that evening and was looking forward to some sleep. Well, that didn't happen. About 3 a.m., I was suddenly awakened by claymores being exploded and rifle and machine gun fire. My platoon lay in their ambush positions waiting for movement in front of them, like a football offensive line, waiting for the snap. I got on the radio, asked Gary what the hell is happening. He told me that his platoon had seen movement on the trail and had set off the ambush. I remember thinking I hoped they weren't trigger happy because I would be the one to explain to the CO why they screwed up. It was pitch dark, so I called for artillery illumination rounds and walked about 50 yards over to Gary's position. That's probably not too smart because the guys had just popped the ambush and would still be jumpy. I was yelling my call sign, telling him to cease fire. I found Gary and could see 3 or 4 dead Viet Cong in the kill zone with no U.S. casualties. Since this was Gary's first ambush, I let him call into battalion headquarters giving the details and body count. And this is where the mission began to fall apart. The battalion XO wanted a body count confirmed. Gary and I could see 3 or 4 bodies, but the XO ordered Gary to walk the kill zone. This time, I should have told Gary to wait 5 minutes and report a standard operation reply, 5 VC dead carrying AKs and rice, but I didn't. Hell, it was 3 in the morning. The bodies would have been there at sunrise. This is what was happening. In the Army, information flows up and down the chain of command, and the battalions report to the brigades, who report to the division, on to the Corps headquarters, and this is where the good folks back home get their daily body count for the 6 o'clock news. Gary and I lined up a squad from our platoons to sweep the kill zone. As the men were searching for bodies, artillery illumination flares were the only light we had, and that wasn't very much. You could barely make out the profiles of the men. I certainly could not identify which platoon was which. Gary and I were standing together discussing how stupid this sweep was, when out of the darkness I heard a couple of rifle shots. Shots sounded like an M16. I thought the shots were from our men, so I yelled, "Cease fire!" to keep someone from getting shot from friendly fire. The next few moments happened very fast, but over the past 46 years I've slowed them down and replayed those hundreds of times in my mind. You have to understand that the only light was artillery illumination, and the terrain was thin grass about 3 feet high. There was confusion and talking about the recent ambush. The men's adrenaline was pumping as we searched for additional dead VC. This was not a damn training exercise. This was combat, and people get hurt or killed if they're not careful. As Gary and I stood talking about how stupid this sweep was and what a mistake the battalion XO made while he was 5 miles away in a safe bunker, something hit me in the chest. It reminded me of my baseball days. Felt like I'd missed a catch of a ball from a kid. Bam, it hit me. Next, I yelled something. To this day, I don't understand why, other than training and instincts kicked in. I yelled, "Grenade!" Dove to my right. There was an explosion. It was not loud. It was kind of muffled. I felt something on my back, a burning sensation. I remembered later thinking being wounded did not feel like I thought it would. Felt like a cut with a sharp knife. My survival instincts kicked in, and I immediately started looking for my rifle, but through the dirt and darkness, I couldn't find it. I looked over at Gary. He wasn't moving. I touched him. I immediately knew he was dead. I yelled for a medic, and when I turned him over, I could see his shirt was blown open and my rifle lay under him. The doc looked at Gary and shook his head. I picked up my rifle and saw that the magazine and receiver were blown up. I grabbed Gary's rifle, checked it out, put in a new magazine, started looking for the VC who threw the grenade. I knew he was close because he had just tossed a grenade at me. I was crawling on my stomach when I saw him. Luckily for me, his attention was directed at the men on the sweep. I stood up and emptied half a magazine in him at full automatic. I think the reason he was laying in the grass in a depressed hole was probably because he was wounded in the initial blowing of the ambush. He had an AK-47 with a grenade launcher attached. This muffled the sound of the AK to make it sound like an M16, and when he fired, I thought he was one of my men. I went back to Gary knowing he'd just given his life for me. Emotionally, his death didn't really hit me for a couple of days. I've often wondered why I reacted the way I did, but in retrospect, I had been calloused by all the death around me, and I had had a job as a leader to regroup the platoons to prepare for a counterattack. We didn't know what was out there in the darkness. I had the men gather up the VC's weapons in both platoons, formed a defensive position, and we moved Gary's body to my CP. In about an hour or so, the sun started to rise, and I started talking to the battalion CP, requested a dust-off for Gary's body. Dust-off came. We loaded the AKs, Gary on the Huey. Lima platoon's men were shaken because they'd lost 2 platoon leaders in less than a month. So I had to jerk them back to reality and remind them that we were still on a combat mission with a job to kill VCs. Next day, February 15th, I was told to consolidate Lima and Mike platoons and move out on the east-west trail that Mike had set their ambush on the night before. Mike took the lead, Lima followed. Setting up my formation, I had Patrick Dugan walking point because he was my best and most experienced point man. We'd only gone about 500 yards when all hell broke loose. AK fire incoming, M16s, M60s firing back. I got on the radio and started calling in artillery, adjusting and firing for effect. There was a FAC flying over me. He asked if I needed any help. In so many words, I said, hell yes. The FAC had 2 F4s on station with miniguns and napalm. We popped smoke. They rolled in with their miniguns. They were so low that the shell casings were still hot when they fell on us. 2 napalm bombs were dropped next. I thought, well, hell, that's it. We got 'em. So we got up, but immediately started getting small arms fire. I called in a hunter-killer team, which was a Cobra helicopter, along with a Loach firing a minigun. They made a couple of runs. We stopped getting incoming fire. As if enough had not happened, the Loach, circling overhead looking for VC, lost its tail rotor. It started rotating out of control and came down through the trees. The Loach settled on the ground, on its skids, almost as if the pilot had landed it. We ran over. I opened the door, asked the pilot if he was okay. He was talking, so we unbuckled him and pulled him out. Just as we cleared the helicopter, it caught on fire, and the ammo from the minigun started cooking off. We regrouped. That's when I found out that my point man, Patrick Dugan, had been killed when the VC popped their ambush. I'd lost a friend and a member of my platoon, and it wasn't even lunchtime. I huddled everyone together and called a dust-off for Dugan and the pilot. Strange how combat puts a twist on emotions, but I laugh about the pilot we pulled out of the Loach. He was scared shitless and was walking around with his .38 revolver cocked. His main concern was that he would have to spend the night with us in the jungle. Before I could get everyone organized and moved out, I got a call that the battalion was sending in copters to pick us up. This was definitely okay with me because I was tired of playing G.I. Joe. When the copters picked us up and landed at Lockhart, the company had a trailer of beer iced down for us. This was the therapy I think we all needed. And I began to let everything soak in, only to wait for the next mission. Over the next year, we would have too many moments to reflect upon for 18, 21-year-old kids.
I'm here with Jess Lockhart, author of Valentine's Day, powerfully read by Alan Sater. Jess, the part of that story that moves me the most when I can catch my breath is your observation about how much rested on the shoulders of 20 and 21-year-old leaders That story, men die, napalm, air cover, crashing helicopters, all before lunch. And then you say, and there were months and years ahead of this. Did you think you were capable of that?
I've often thought about this, and, there was a series, Band of Brothers. It is so true that in the military, you are brothers. It's hard to explain to somebody that someone would give their life for you, but that's what Gary did. Gary, without hesitation, jumped on that grenade, and I will forever think about him, and I've tried to lead my life, again, rededicate my life to somebody like him. I was a type guy, I drank hard and played hard, and Gary was the Boy Scout. He might have been an Eagle Scout, I don't know, but he was just the opposite of me. And you wonder why someone like that's taken and someone like myself lives. But it worked out that way.
This happened to a 21-year-old combat lieutenant, only a couple months in country. How did you understand it then?
You don't understand it. You just react, and you have a job. After I got in country, I was damn sure that I wasn't going to make it back. And so once you get past that point, you just react to situations.
In that rice paddy at night, Jess, when Gary had thrown himself on that grenade, your first instinct was to take a rifle and go find the guy that threw that grenade. That's always been remarkable to me. Why do you think that was your first instinct?
Well, my first instinct was to check Gary to see how bad he was hurt. And I think I was more pissed than anything else. Here's someone who'd gotten killed, and so I found Gary's rifle, and shoved another magazine in it, and then I went looking for the guy that threw the grenade.
In later years, I know that there's a story about Gary being honored by your unit that you've told me. Could you tell me that story again, where you tried to contact his father?
Gary was awarded the Medal of Honor. And so the 1st Infantry Division has a black tie dinner in Washington every April. And I started going to it, and I had the idea of maybe us honoring Gary's father, because he was the unit's Medal of Honor recipient. So I went over to Covington to pick up his father. I walked into their house, and Gary's mother had left his room just as he left when he left to go to Vietnam, and made it almost a shrine. And that was very difficult to walk into. Gary's father rode with me from Covington to Washington. And all the way to Washington, he quizzed me on what happened that day and why it happened and what Gary had done. He had opened up the casket and saw the body. He had lots of questions about, was Gary shot? What happened and all. That was a rough trip going to Washington and back, but I'm glad we did it.
And then they wanted to honor Gary with a bridge.
Yeah. Yes. The city of Covington, a couple of years ago, I got a notification that they wanted to name a bridge after Gary. And I thought, my God, a bridge for what this guy had done. But I went up there and at the dedication service, I talked about Gary. It was an honor to do that. And it added a little bit of closure for me.
I remember years ago, I said Gary had won the Medal of Honor, and you corrected me and you said, you don't win it. It's awarded to you.
I remember that night too. I was a little intimidated by you, but that's one of my buttons you push with me is when people say, oh, you won the Purple Heart. No, I didn't win the Purple Heart. In fact, I wish I had never gotten it. But you're awarded recognition. You don't win it. It's not a lottery.
Now, our second story, Bender, also performed by Alan Sater. Then I'll talk more with author Jess Lockhart.
Mike Platoon was just finishing a scheduled 3-night, 2-day R&R after a month of patrol missions. I told the platoon sergeant to form the platoon in front of the company headquarters. I stood in front of the platoon looking at a bunch of guys who could have been character actors in a hobo movie. They had ammo bandoliers, claymore mines, socks filled with sea rations hanging all over themselves. As ragtag as they looked, they were my men and brothers. We'd mostly arrived in country within a few weeks of each other and had learned our trade together. And we were pretty good. I yelled in my best 22-year-old command voice, "Report!" The platoon sergeant answered, 14 men present, 2 on R&R, 1 in the platoon tent. I went over to the platoon sergeant and asked in a low voice, "And what do you mean, 1 in the platoon tent?" He replied, "Bender refuses to come to the formation." I told him to take charge of the platoon, stomped off toward the platoon tent. I opened the flaps of the partially lit large tent, saw Bender sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at the walls. As I approached Bender, I told him, "Hey, get your gear, get out in formation." Bender replied, "I ain't going." I sat beside him and asked, "What?" He told me he'd had a dream the night before that if he went on this mission, he was going to die. I tried to explain that we all had moments when we were scared, but we worked through it. It had only been a dream. Again, "I told you, I ain't going." "You know you could get court-martialed for missing a movement?" He replied, "I ain't going." I went to the company command post, told the first sergeant that Bender was in the platoon tent. I returned to the platoon to board trucks, load on helicopters to be inserted somewhere on an unnamed trail to start our 14-day mission. After we got settled in our ambush site, I asked my RTO what Bender's problem was. He told me that before I had taken over the platoon, they'd almost been annihilated. Only 6 men survived, 2 of whom were wounded. A man on watch had fallen asleep, and the VC walked up and sprayed them all as they slept, killing 10 men. Bender was one of the 2 men wounded. He got an AK round in his butt and was in the hospital for 3 months. Bender was the last of the survivors left in country, and he only had 2 months left in his 12-month tour. After 7 days, we were resupplied. I got a note from the first sergeant that Bender was up on charges to be court-martialed. 2 months earlier, I had written Bender up for a Bronze Star with a V for pulling 2 wounded men back to the medic during a firefight. So here he was, getting court-martialed, and he had a CIB, Bronze Star with a V, Purple Heart, and an Air Medal for 40-plus air assault missions, including the other Vietnam medals. This guy was not a coward. He was just a 20-year-old kid who got scared. I later found out Bender did get court-martialed, sentenced to spend the remainder of his tour in Long Bien jail. He received a dishonorable discharge. The next time I saw Bender was at the platoon's reunion in 1995. During the reunion, I got him off to the side, asked him how things were going. He told me he finished his tour in LBJ, came back to the States where he was discharged. He returned to his old neighborhood in Newark where he'd grown up and gone to school. His neighbors ostracized him, and he was deprived of a soldier's privilege of telling war stories or showing medals that he'd earned. He couldn't even get a decent job because of the dishonorable discharge. Bender finally found a lawyer who got the discharge upgraded. He continued with his life, but with the shame hanging over him. In his mind, he felt he had let his brothers down and was a coward. That night in my motel room, I told my wife that Bender had broken my heart because I felt I had let him down. I should have done something that morning rather than walking away and leaving him to face a court-martial. I considered myself a good combat leader, but as a 22-year-old, the Army had not prepared me to cope with the psychological challenges of an infantry platoon leader. After Vietnam, the Army recognized PTSD as a disorder and trained leaders in identifying and helping soldiers with symptoms rather than simply kicking the soldier aside, possibly ruining his life. Sunday afternoon at the reunion, as everyone was hugging each other and saying their goodbyes, Bender came up to me and thanked me for letting him come to the reunion. With a lump in my throat, I told him, "Bill, you were just a 20-year-old kid who got scared. You have nothing to be ashamed of. We were all scared. You just dealt with the problem differently. The Army handled the issue wrong. You were drafted, served your country. You didn't run to Canada or try to avoid the draft as a conscientious objector. You will always be a part of this platoon." Bender's come to a couple of reunions since then. I always give him a hug. I'm now almost 70 years old. It's been 47 years since that morning in Lyke. Sometimes I ponder what I could have done differently to keep Bender from facing a court-martial. I knew most of the officers on that board. I know I could have explained Bender's frame of mind. I wasn't there for him, and I'll have to live with that decision. I never judge a veteran's service because we're all brothers and sisters with common thread of compassion that runs through us.
That was Bender, read by Alan Sater. Jess, that is, along with Valentine's Day, a powerful testament to that old saying that old men make war, young men fight them. 21-year-old Gary first, Bender, you. Talk to me, looking back over those 5 decades, about the young man you were and how impossible it must seem to you now that those burdens were shouldered by such young men.
This was not my proudest moment, to leave a guy behind like that I could have saved. And I've often thought about it, but I had no choice. We were on a mission and we had to move out. But like I said in the story, I think in retrospect that if I would have been there for his trial, I could have explained his situation better. But I wasn't. And I will always live with that. You live with your decisions. And that's a decision that I will always live with.
You said in the story, Bender, that the Army had not fully recognized PTSD as a combat condition when this happened. Did you recognize it? I mean, you were there. You were in the weeds. Did you know what you were seeing?
My leadership training that the Army gave me was tactical training, not how to handle emotional situations. In fact, the Army had a philosophy that if in training, if they could break you, they would, so you would not break down during combat. Everything that they trained me on was towards combat and combat leadership, not how to handle emotional disturbances with the men. And believe me, you get a lot of them from guys who girlfriends send them Dear John letters to people like Bender there. I was told one time by someone that the definition of bravery was when you're scared to death to do something, but you go ahead and do it anyway.
Winston Churchill said that courage is cowardice that waits 1 minute. Well, in fairness to yourself and to Bender, these are again 19, 20, 21-year-old men. And you say you had no training to deal with this situation specifically. Looking back on it, have you been kind to 21-year-old Jess?
I don't really know. You live it day by day, and I think that I reflected on the way that I was brought up and the morals and examples that my parents gave me and the people that helped me through high school and all. I don't think there's a cookie cutter definition for all of this. I think that you just have to do the best you can and play the cards that are dealt you.
I'm going to stay on this for one more turn, Jess. You hold yourself to a pretty high standard. That 21-year-old young man whose life was saved by a friend, who lost friends, who, as you said in Valentine's Day, had to push aside a lot of your own personal humanity, to get through combat. And looking back on that, I want to ask you, what fairly could you expect from yourself as a boy, given these responsibilities?
When I got to Vietnam, of all the medals and stuff that I've got on my records, one thing that's not there is that in November 1968, there was 18 of us that got off an airplane together within a couple of weeks of each other. A year later, 16 of us got back on an airplane. And I'm more proud of that than I am any medals or anything that I've ever received. But when I first got there, I was pretty sure that I was not going to make it back. And I didn't want to know the names of my men. I didn't want to get close to them, because if I had to take you and tell you to go walk point, knowing that you're probably going to get killed, I didn't want to know about your wife or your girlfriend or your car or anything. That just muddied up my decision. But, being human beings, you do find out stuff. And we have a reunion every 2 years of my platoon. We're having it this year up in Connecticut. And the guys are real close. And I wasn't as close to the guys as they were, even though we went out on missions and all together. Our downtime, I didn't go drinking with them. I didn't go to the village with them. So I was kind of distant, and I wanted to keep it that way. And I think that's the way you make it through it.
You stayed a long time in the military. You finished up a colonel, yeah?
Lieutenant colonel.
Mm-hmm. How many years?
23 years. And I never regretted one day of it. People meet me, they often say, "Thank you for your service." And my standard reply is, "It was my pleasure."
Thank you, Jess. It's always a pleasure and an honor to know you, my brother. And I'm glad to hear I intimidated you. I'm gonna brag about that one. If you'd like to learn more about the Mighty Pen or just send us your thoughts, email us at mpodcast@vawarmemorial.org or use the link in the podcast description. If you're a veteran or a family member of a serviceman or woman listening to this podcast anywhere in America, and you want to learn how to best tell your own powerful stories, you can sign up for one of our Mighty Pen writing workshops on Zoom. If you want to read today's pieces and many more, use the link to go to the Mighty Pen archive. And if you enjoy this podcast, please share it. Music for this episode was provided by Jackson Albrecht. Lastly, if you'd like to support the Mighty Pen's efforts to record and preserve these stories of service, adventure, and sacrifice, follow the charitable donation link in the podcast description. I'm David L. Robbins, and I want to thank you for listening to the Mighty Pen podcast. It's an honor.